They came at dusk, black sails appearing on the horizon where the waters of Blackwater Bay seemed to swallow the last traces of daylight. A chill wind rolled in off the sea, carrying the sense of salt, and something older and sharper, as if the waves themselves could not keep the secrets of 1,000 drowned sailors. The black-sailed vessel bore the crest of the Iron Bank of Bravos, an iron coin on a field of midnight, and it moved with a slow, steady inevitability, almost as though the tide pulled it toward King's Landing rather than the other way around. From the highest balcony of the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister watched the approaching ship. The evening sky bled orange and crimson behind her, and her gold and scarlet gown shimmered in the final rays of the dying sun. Though she might have appeared regal to an unknowing eye, a keen observer would notice the tension in her posture, the way her fingers tightened on the railing. The Iron Bank had come, and while she had expected them to favor her still, she could not help feeling the old pang of unease. Some part of her remembered their unwavering stance, the debts they demanded repaid, no matter the cost. But she was queen now, and she told herself that fear did not become her. Below in the courtyard, the hush that followed the arrival of Bravosi envoys was as tangible as the stones beneath the Red Keep. A handful of Lannister guards in bright red cloaks held their spears at the ready, though they did not present their arms in threat. The Bravosi banker who disembarked was a slender, angular man with close-cropped hair, the color of soot. Flanked by 2 associates, he moved with careful deliberation, his expression unreadable. Cersei continued to watch from above, her lips pressed into a thin line. She wished she had not dismissed Qyburn so abruptly that morning, for even though he was no maester, he had an uncanny way of gleaning knowledge that might have put her mind at ease. For the moment, she had only her own counsel, and the memory of how the Iron Bank had once turned against the crown in favor of Stannis Baratheon. But times had changed. She was certain she could coax gold from them again, or at least hold them at bay with the promise of Lannister wealth. The House Lannister might be diminished, but the gold of Casterly Rock still carried weight. For all the cunning that Cersei lacked in finer matters, she knew how to spin an illusion. A bank, after all, thrived on the appearance of solvency. Word spread quickly through the castle that representatives of the Iron Bank had arrived. By the time the Bravosi were escorted into the throne room, torches had been lit, casting flickers of dancing shadows across the polished floor. Cersei descended the steps of the Iron Throne in measured steps, wearing the confidence of a lioness. She greeted the envoys as though she expected the courtesy of a doge from Bravos. Full bowing, scraping, an immediate display of subservience. Instead, the slender man bowed only slightly at the waist. They introduced themselves and spoke in turn, their voices melodious but firm. Their purpose, as always, was the Iron Bank's purpose: to see debts repaid and to determine where future investments might be most advantageously placed. They had weathered kings and queens, wars and rebellions, and they would weather them all again, unchanging in their pursuit of settlement. For now, they remained polite, yielding no hint of disapproval or favor. Cersei invited them to dine that evening, intending to display the finery left in the city's coffers, to show that the crown could still muster grandeur. The slender man inclined his head politely, though whether in acceptance or wry amusement, it was impossible to tell. That night, the Red Keep glowed with candlelight, and the long tables of the dining hall sagged beneath a spread of roasted meats, fresh fruit, and flagons of wine. Music drifted through the hall, a somnolent tune that lulled conversation into a soft hum. Cersei presided at the high table, wine goblet in hand, wearing an expression she had worn years before, when she had tried to charm the nobles of King's Landing for Joffrey's sake. She spoke in cool, measured tones to the bankers, touting the might of the Lannister legacy, her control of the crown, and her promise to restore the realm's prosperity. All the while, she studied the bankers' faces, noting every twitch, every half-smile that never quite reached their eyes. At length, the slender man, who introduced himself as Rhaegar, though he offered no surname, spoke of the Iron Bank's concerns regarding the realm's stability. With the War of the Five Kings concluded in part and the North fractious under new leadership, the question of rightful rule had been raised yet again. The Iron Bank had not come to King's Landing just for old debts. They were keen to ensure that their gold, when lent, would be placed in hands that were capable, stable, and likely to remain in power. Cersei's lips twitched. She knew these words were carefully chosen, neither an insult nor outright flattery. She replied in kind, forging a mask of tranquility. She assured them that King's Landing was secure, that the remnants of rebellion were being stamped out, that the crown had loyal supporters in every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. She spoke with quiet ferocity, the kind that once made lesser lords quake. Her voice resounded over the music. She was a lioness, and she would not let them see her doubt. That very same night, far to the north, Sansa Stark walked the silent corridors of Winterfell. The ancient stones held the warmth of a newly lit hearth, and the sconces in the halls flickered with dancing flames. Outside, the chill wind carried the bite of impending snowfall, for winter's teeth had begun to press into the land again. Sansa wore a heavy cloak of dark gray wool lined with white fur, the sigil of House Stark embroidered on the back in subtle thread. She had grown into a steady composure, an inner resolve layered over the wounds of her past. The North was hers to guide now, though some part of her still felt the weight of that responsibility with every step she took. In the main hall, she found herself in conversation with the northern lords who had gathered. Their words, low and urgent, all turned to the same topic: the uncertainty that haunted the realm. They had heard rumors that the Iron Bank was again looking to secure alliances, to finance a leader with a vision, and the gratitude to pay back bravos. They wondered whether the bank would once more turn against the crown if the crown could not keep its promises. Sansa listened quietly, absorbing what she could. She remembered well how the Iron Bank had once invested in Stannis Baratheon, and though that gambit had ended in ruin, the bankers' resolve had never wavered. They had been prepared to bankroll a second attempt if it meant a return on their gold. Sansa knew that the crown was deeply in debt. No matter how much gold the crown had reclaimed after the Saxon battles, the Lannisters had spent beyond their means. Now, with Casterly Rock's mines rumored to be all but empty, Sansa wondered whether the Iron Bank would find in her and the North a more viable investment. It was all speculation, of course, but the whispers continued. That night, in her solar, Sansa pored over ledgers and accounts, seeking ways to strengthen the North's economy. The land had endured harsh times, and while the memory of the Bolton Rule still cast its dark shadow, things had begun to recover under her guidance. Granaries were being refilled. Cloth trade was picking up. Loyal blacksmiths worked day and night, forging arms and tools for the expansion of farmland. Peace, tenuous though it was, had brought new life to Winterfell. She set aside her quill and leaned back, feeling the fire's warmth on her skin. She let her thoughts drift to the night sky beyond the window, where the moon cast a silver glow across the snows. Somewhere in that darkness, the Bravos were planning their next move. She could almost sense the cogs turning in the labyrinthine minds of the bankers who weighed profit against risk with ruthless clarity. Part of her trembled with the question: what if they came for her? What if they offered the gold that might secure the North's future in exchange for her alliance against the Lannisters? She did not relish the idea of becoming a piece on the Iron Bank's game board. She had been a pawn too many times already. But if they came, if their gold could protect her people, would she spurn it? Or would she greet them with open arms? She thought of the long winter still ahead, and the precarious position of the North. The question remained unanswered in her mind long after she drifted into a restless sleep. Days passed, and the black-sailed ship in King's Landing lingered. The Bravos envoys attended private meetings behind closed doors, with courtiers and merchants, with Master of Coin placeholders, and with anyone who might influence the payment of the crown's debts. Each conversation was noted carefully, recorded in discreet ledgers that traveled with them at all times. Cersei hosted them repeatedly, including them in small councils, striding about in her regal dresses, always speaking of the Lannister strength and the security she would bring to the realm. And for a time it almost seemed that everything was as it should be, that the Iron Bank had come only for a straightforward renegotiation of debts and rates. But the Bravosi did not sign any new agreements, nor did they give any sign of concluding their business. Subtle changes were afoot. Raven scrolls, sealed with the iron coin of Bravos, began to take flight from King's Landing in different directions. The city's gold cloaks watched, but they could not track every messenger or glean the contents of every letter. Whispers leaked into Flea Bottom of clandestine dealings with powerful families. The name Sansa Stark began to appear in hushed rumors, the possible new partner for Braavos, someone who was forging a better path in the north. It was only after a particularly tense small council meeting that Cersei received word. The envoys had sent a letter to Winterfell. A Lannister guard captain, overhearing a conversation between the Braavosi men, had gleaned that the Iron Bank was considering an alternative. The moment Cersei heard the name Stark, her hand clenched around the arm of her chair, nails digging into polished wood until small splinters bit at her skin. The old hatred rose in her like a wave. Her father had once told her that the only way to quell an enemy was to crush them utterly. But Sansa Stark was not just an enemy. She was a reminder of Ned Stark, a thorn in Cersei's side for years. That red-haired girl from her memory had survived unspeakable horrors. Cersei had thought the last scion of the old northern power might fade away, but it seemed the young wolf was thriving, building alliances, collecting debts of her own. Cersei summoned Qyburn. She told him to investigate every step the Braavosi took. She demanded a solution to remove Sansa Stark from their calculations, if indeed the Iron Bank was foolish enough to court her. Qyburn, with his measured voice and insidious intellect, merely bowed his head and promised to do all he could. Nothing in his face revealed fear or concern. And for once, Cersei envied that composure. Yet the Iron Bank's intentions remained elusive. Even as the envoys maintained their outward courtesy toward Cersei, they were quietly sending word north. Sansa received a single raven scroll one cold morning, with a message that was maddeningly succinct. The envoy wished to speak with her, to discuss matters of financial support and stability for the North, as well as the fate of the crown. It bore the seal of the Iron Bank and the signature of the slender man, Rhaegar, who styled himself as a senior representative. The mere sight of that black wax emblem made her chest tighten with uncertainty. She kept the letter secret from most of her advisors, showing it only to a small circle of trusted confidants: Brian of Tarth, Davos Seaworth, and a handful of northern lords who had proven unwaveringly loyal. They discussed it in Sansa's solar by the light of a single lamp. Her cloak was drawn around her shoulders, and though the fire crackled in the hearth, the tension in the air chilled them more than the winter outside. Davos spoke quietly, urging caution. He remembered well how the Iron Bank had offered loans to Stannis, and how the terms were always stacked in favor of Braavos. Brienne, standing beside Sansa, voiced her concern about trusting any southern or foreign power. The northern lords worried about debt that might chain Winterfell to an agenda beyond its borders. Yet the possibility also dangled a real advantage. With the Iron Bank's gold, they could rebuild faster, protect their people more thoroughly, and perhaps even contest the Lannister hold on King's Landing if it ever came to that. Sansa said little, listening to the arguments swirl around her. She recalled her childhood dreams of knights and tournaments, of golden lions and silver stags. Now, she understood that reality was made of ink on parchment, as often as it was made of swords on the battlefield. Debt and contract could shift the fortunes of lords as surely as a battle cry could. She dismissed the council with a kind, tired smile, asking for time alone to weigh the letter's request. They each bowed or nodded in respect, departing one by one until she was alone with the flickering lamp. Hours later, she drafted a reply to Rhaegar. She wrote in careful, measured prose, inviting the Iron Bank's envoy to Winterfell if he wished to speak in person. The North would meet any foreign visitor with courtesy, provided they came in peace. She offered no promise or acceptance of terms. Her words were neutral, neither encouraging nor discouraging. At the end, she added her own seal: the direwolf of House Stark in gray wax. Her hand trembled only slightly. Winter came in fits and starts that year. One day brought a fierce blizzard that hammered the walls of Winterfell, burying the courtyard in fresh drifts, and the next day brought a fragile reprieve of pale sunlight. It was just after the snows had quieted that Rhaegar's envoy arrived, traveling over land with a small retinue of Braavosi guards and a single covered carriage. Their approach was cautious. Word had traveled among the smaller villages that armed riders were heading toward the Stark stronghold, and some worried these men bore ill intentions. But Sansa had prepared for them, sending riders of her own to ensure their safe passage. They arrived at the gates, the Braavosi men wrapped in thick cloaks, their faces reddened by the frigid air. Rhaegar himself emerged from the carriage, stepping onto the snow-packed ground with light, careful steps. He was indeed as slender as rumor claimed, with eyes that seemed too large for his face, keen and dark. His expression remained inscrutable as he was ushered inside, though he inclined his head in greeting to those who welcomed him. Sansa received him in the main hall, where a fire roared in the massive hearth, and the long tables had been cleared to make room for chairs set before the warmth of the flame. They exchanged pleasantries, Sansa noting the soft accent of Braavos in his voice. She thanked him for traveling so far north in such treacherous conditions. He replied politely that the Iron Bank had always prided itself on reaching clients no matter the distance, so long as the venture was worthwhile. His gaze flicked over the great hall, and Sansa felt a flicker of gratitude that she had managed to see Winterfell mostly restored. The cracks and scorch marks of the Bolton occupation were gone. The banners of House Stark hung proudly once more, the direwolf rampant in gray and white. She offered him a seat and a cup of warm mulled wine, which he accepted with a courteous dip of his head. For a while, they spoke idly of the North's conditions, the farmland expansions, the roads that would soon become impassable in the deep winter. Sansa allowed the conversation to unfold at a leisurely pace, noting Rhaegar's interest in the state of trade. He asked discreetly about the North's capabilities for repaying any future loans, about alliances Sansa might have beyond Winterfell's walls. She answered only as much as was wise, weaving her words carefully, never fully committing to or rejecting anything. And throughout, Rhaegar gave nothing away, only nodding thoughtfully, occasionally sipping from his cup, a small smile playing at his lips. Eventually, Brienne entered quietly, standing at Sansa's side as a silent guard, and Davos followed. Rhaegar acknowledged them with polite greetings. It was then that the conversation took a more serious turn. The slender man leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees in a poised manner. "The Iron Bank," he said softly, "has long found House Stark to be honorable. There are few houses in Westeros whose word carries such weight with so little embellishment. Though the Crown in King's Landing owes a significant debt, we have come to realize that stability in the realm might better be found elsewhere." None. Sansa's heartbeat quickened at his frankness. She glanced at Davos, whose face remained impassive, though his hands tightened slightly at his sides. She felt Brienne shift her weight, a subtle sign of tension in the tall warrior's bearing. Rhaegar continued, "The Crown's capacity to repay has diminished. The Queen Regent, Cersei Lannister, claims that the gold mines of the Westerlands remain rich, but our sources do not confirm that. She promises peace, yet we see only the seeds of further discord. It is the policy of the Iron Bank to invest where returns are assured, and we have reason to believe that the North's rebuilding efforts, under strong leadership, present an alternative worthy of consideration." Menin. He paused to let his words sink in. Sansa took a breath, maintaining her composure, though her mind spun with the implications. She had suspected this was coming, but to hear it stated so plainly changed the shape of her future in an instant. If the Iron Bank chose to back her, it would be both an enormous responsibility and a direct challenge to King's Landing. It would mean gold to rebuild, to feed her people through the winter, to ensure that northern trade could flourish. But it would also paint a target on her back, marking her as a threat to Cersei's rule. She did not let the flicker of uncertainty show on her face. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap, meeting Rhaegar's gaze with the calm that she had learned through years of trials far more harrowing than this moment. She thanked him for his honesty and said she would need time to consider the offer. He merely nodded, acknowledging the weight of such a decision. That evening, Sansa hosted a modest feast for her Braavosi visitors, ensuring they experienced a taste of northern hospitality. The long tables were laden with hearty fare: roasted venison, thick stews, warm bread, mulled wine. The flickering torchlight caught the edges of steel banners overhead and the carved direwolves that adorned the hall. The Braavosi men ate politely, though they seemed far more reserved than the free-flowing courtiers in the south. Rhaegar himself spoke little, observing the hall, the food, the people with the manner of a man inventorying every detail. Sansa circulated among the tables, exchanging words with her lords, with Davos, with Brienne, all the while feeling the quiet pressure of Rhaegar's presence. He was here to strike a bargain, but the shape of that bargain remained unclear. The Iron Bank never gave away gold for nothing. They demanded profits, influence, and if need be, they would topple a queen to ensure their gold returned with interest. When at last the fires burned low, and the Braavosi envoys retired to their quarters, Sansa walked alone in the courtyard. The cold air stung her cheeks, but she welcomed the solitude. She looked up at the night sky, studded with stars so bright they seemed like shards of ice. The moonlight washed over the stone walls and the fresh snow, rendering the world stark and silver. She thought of the next steps, of what alliances might protect the North if she accepted the Iron Bank's support. There were other powers stirring in Westeros, not least of which was the threat that Cersei might see any such alliance as a direct act of treason. Perhaps it was. But Sansa recalled the heartbreak and ruin her house had suffered at the hands of southern ambitions. Perhaps forging an alliance with Braavos was a necessary risk. If the Iron Bank would help the North stand on its own, maybe that was the best way to protect her people from another southern war. She retired late, and yet sleep eluded her. She lay in her bed, staring at the canopy above, thinking of the swirling possibilities. She pictured Cersei's face twisted in anger when she learned the Iron Bank had turned to the last surviving Stark daughter. She imagined the slender man Rhaegar, with his unblinking stare, calculating the potential of Winterfell. In her mind, she saw an uncertain future, but perhaps the first chance in years to truly free the North from the crushing hand of Lannister debts. Morning brought pale light and an aching wind. Rhaegar sought her out shortly after breakfast, asking for a moment of her time in private. They adjourned to a smaller chamber off the main hall, warmed by a modest fireplace, and furnished with only a table and 2 chairs. He carried a small, finely crafted wooden box, which he set gently upon the table. Then he unlatched it, and removed a scroll tied with a ribbon in Braavosi blue. He explained that this was a preliminary contract. Terms, interest rates, obligations, amounts. The Iron Bank would supply a substantial loan, in both gold and supplies that might be harder to come by in the frozen North. In return, House Stark, and by extension, the North, would recognize certain privileges and commercial rights for Braavosi shipping and trade. The details were extensive, some sections still blank, awaiting Sansa's input. Rhaegar assured her that negotiation was expected, that the Iron Bank was prepared to adjust certain terms if it meant a mutually beneficial arrangement. Sansa accepted the scroll with careful hands, scanning the elegant Braavosi script. The numbers were staggering. Enough gold to do far more than patch the cracks. Enough to rebuild roads, fortify watchtowers, expand farmland, and raise new garrisons for the protection of all northern territories. In exchange, Braavosi merchants would be granted the right to build counting houses in White Harbor, and, in time, perhaps in other northern ports. Taxes would be levied at a lower rate for Braavosi ships, though not so low as to bankrupt local trade. More alarming was the clause that required House Stark to support any Iron Bank intervention if the Crown attempted to undermine Braavosi interests. This would inevitably pit her against King's Landing if or when Cersei struck back. Still, Sansa's pulse quickened. She saw a chance here, albeit a dangerous one. She told Rhaegar she would consult with her advisors, though she would keep the circle small for discretion's sake. She promised him a reply soon. The Braavosi man smiled, and though it was a thin, almost ghostly curve of his lips, it carried genuine satisfaction. He carefully returned the scroll to his box, locked it, and placed the key on a silver chain around his neck. Then he bowed and left her to her thoughts. The day passed in a blur of quiet talks. She met first with Davos, who, despite his reservations, acknowledged that the North needed a strong source of gold. The old smuggler rubbed a hand over his beard and spoke in that gentle, gravelly voice. If they did not take the Iron Bank's offer, he reminded her, the Crown might do so in desperation, or the Iron Bank might find some other contender for the throne. And if that happened, House Stark could find itself alone once again, facing the cunning of Cersei Lannister without any support. Even Davos, who had lost so much to ill-fated alliances, admitted that this might be their best hope to stave off tyranny from the south. Brienne urged caution above all. She reminded Sansa that the Iron Bank acted out of profit, not honor. She wondered if the North would lose its autonomy by binding itself to a foreign bank. If a day would come when the Stark name was overshadowed by Braavosi demands. Sansa listened, recalling the times she had lost her freedom. The idea of setting any measure of northern independence to outsiders made her stomach twist, but the alternative might be far worse. They called in only a handful of the northern lords, men and women Sansa trusted completely. Lady Mormont among them, whose fierce young voice would brook no nonsense. They reviewed the terms, muttered curses at the demands, but ultimately recognized the enormous benefit. The north was wide and sparsely populated compared to the south. Its fields produced less year-round, and the long winters could decimate reserves. With Braavosi backing, Winterfell could feed its people, maintain its roads, and train an army strong enough to protect itself from whatever new war the Iron Throne provoked. When night came, Sansa walked the ramparts of Winterfell alone, the box containing the contract clasped in her hands. The cold air bit into her cheeks, but she hardly noticed. Looking out over the snow-covered rooftops, she wondered how her father would have decided. Honor, he would have said. Duty to the realm. She thought of her mother, who had been so fierce in her love for her family, who had done everything to protect them, to keep them together. Now, perhaps it was Sansa's turn to do the same, to protect and keep together the North that had been entrusted to her. Sometimes, the greater good demanded alliances that were not purely honorable. In the Game of Thrones, every piece of leverage counted. She opened the box and unrolled the contract once more, letting the wind ruffle the parchment. By the torchlight along the wall, she studied the Braavosi terms. She set her jaw and made a vow that if she agreed, she would see to it that the North would not be merely a client and thrall to foreign gold. She would ensure that the North remained strong, respected, and ultimately free. Then, in the silence, she let the wind and the wolves be her only witnesses as she made her decision. The next morning, she summoned Rhaegar to the same small chamber, with Davos at her side and a scribe ready to record any changes. The negotiations began in earnest. The Braavosi man did not seem surprised that she had questions, that she wanted certain concessions. He listened patiently as Sansa insisted on guaranteed autonomy in the North's governance, that no Braavosi counting house would impose separate laws. She insisted that in any war, House Stark would not be forced to fight beyond the neck unless the cause threatened northern lands directly. Rhaegar nodded, offering measured counters. The interest rates could be adjusted higher, for instance, in exchange for greater autonomy. Sansa pushed back, pointing out that crippling interest would do neither side any good. The negotiations spanned hours, and they paused only briefly for water or to stretch their legs. Davos watched carefully, occasionally weighing in with a pragmatic suggestion. His knowledge of trade routes around Westeros and his experience with Shireen and Stannis gave him insight into the ways of Braavosi lenders. By midday, they had hammered out a framework that was stricter than Sansa might have wished, but more flexible than she had feared. The official agreement would require a signature from a representative of the Iron Bank, Rhaegar himself, and from Sansa, as Lady of Winterfell, along with 2 witness signatures from the Northern Lords. When the final draft was laid upon the table, Sansa looked at the rows of graceful Braavosi script. She felt the weight of it pressing on her shoulders. "You must understand," said Rhaegar, his voice gentle but firm, "that once we finalize this, the Iron Bank will move to withdraw certain lines of credit from King's Landing. Queen Cersei is many things, but not a fool. She will see this as an endorsement of your leadership. She may even call it treason." That indeed. Sansa's heart twinged. She had known as much from the start. For a moment, she could almost see Cersei's green eyes blazing with fury, her slender fingers curling around a wine goblet in a choking grip. The story of House Stark and House Lannister was stained with blood. Sansa wondered whether this contract would spark another war. or if it would be the final blow that toppled the Lannisters' fragile hold on the throne. She kept her composure. "The North stands on its own terms," she replied, her voice quiet but unwavering. "If the crown calls that treason, then so be it." Davos dipped a quill into ink and handed it to her. She hesitated only a heartbeat before pressing it to the parchment, signing her name in clear letters. Sansa Stark of House Stark, Lady of Winterfell. Rhaegar took the quill next and signed in his looping Braavosi hand. Then Davos and Lady Mormont, who had insisted on being present for the official conclusion, added their signatures as witnesses. The scribe sprinkled sand over the ink to set it. When the quill was laid down for the last time, a hush settled in the chamber, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The contract lay there, black ink on parchment that might yet shake the foundations of Westeros. Rhaegar carefully rolled it up, sealed it with his own iron coin signet, and placed it back into its box. He bowed to Sansa, deeper than he had before, a gesture not just of politeness, but of respect for a leader he had just recognized in the name of the Iron Bank. She inclined her head in acknowledgement, letting out a breath she had not known she was holding. Outside, the wind whistled across the battlements, and the faint howling of wolves drifted through the crisp air. The first steps had been taken, and there would be no turning back. Over the days that followed, the Braavosi men prepared for their departure. They restocked their provisions, purchased sturdy northern horses, and arranged their papers for the journey back to Braavos. They were guarded about their route, not wishing to encounter Lannister spies, though Sansa promised them safe conduct through the north. Rhaegar assured her that the Iron Bank had long had its own methods of traveling unnoticed. Sansa felt a subtle shift within Winterfell. A sense of guarded optimism mingled with the fear of retribution. The North had seen war already, and if Cersei brought her wrath, there could be war again. But this time, they would not be alone. The gold of Braavos would see to that. When Rhaegar finally rode out of Winterfell with his retinue, the courtyard was quiet. Snow drifted lazily from the sky, settling on the banners that flanked the inner gate. Sansa watched from a rampart, her cloak pulled tight, the fur around her collar sparkling with snow. She thought of the Lannisters in King's Landing, and how they must soon receive word that the Iron Bank had chosen to place its faith and its fortune in the hands of a Stark girl they once saw as naive and malleable. How would Cersei respond to such news? The question loomed like a storm on the horizon, but for now, Sansa took solace in the knowledge that her people might endure the winter more easily. With the coming of spring, who knew what alliances might blossom? The Game of Thrones was fraught with danger. But for the first time, Sansa felt as though she might finally have a piece on the board that could challenge the lion in her den. The day stretched, the sun gliding across a sky of pale gray. Snow melted off the ramparts, trickling into the courtyard below. Sansa turned from the gate and made her way back inside, where decisions waited, tasks beckoned, and hopes brewed for the land she was determined to protect. The Iron Bank's choice had been made, and together, they would see what power might shift in the Seven Kingdoms when a wolf's banner was backed by the gold of Braavos. In Jiwanwei, the passage of days brought a deepening chill to Winterfell. Soft drifts of snow whispered against the castle walls, and each dawn emerged pale and silent, as though the world itself held its breath, waiting for whatever shape the future might assume. Sansa found herself restless, walking the corridors with a hushed focus. The deal with the Iron Bank had been sealed. Ink dried upon thick parchment, pressed beneath Braavosi wax. Rhaegar and his entourage had set out southward. The hush that lingered in their wake was one of apprehension, of hushed excitement, tempered by the fear of reprisal. Within the great hall of Winterfell, the fireplaces blazed day and night, their warmth battling the chill wind that crept in through the cracks. Sansa took her meals there, often joined by Davos or Brienne, and sometimes one of the lords or ladies who had come to bend the knee in recent months. She spoke little of the Braavosi arrangement in public. Outside her most trusted circle, few knew the details of the agreement, though rumors swirled among the castle staff and the townsfolk. Whispers traveled swiftly in the north, carried on tongues that had little else to discuss, now that the wars of the past seemed to fade into memory. She kept herself occupied with the usual duties. The ledgers required careful updates. More farmland had been reclaimed from the overgrowth. Stockpiles needed to be counted. Trade roads had to be surveyed one final time before the snows turned them impassable. Sansa oversaw these tasks with a close eye. Late into the evenings, she examined each scroll of figures by candlelight. The Iron Bank's coin would take time to arrive in full. And so for the moment, every ounce of local resource mattered. The memory of past winters spurred her onward, fueling her determination. Sometimes she paused at the windows overlooking the courtyard. She gazed out upon the bustle of daily chores. Servants hauling sacks of flour to the kitchens, stable hands clearing away soiled straw, blacksmiths hammering steel in the crisp morning light. In these small, mundane scenes, she found an odd solace. It reminded her that the North was not merely an idea, it was people and routine, daily bread and warmth by the fire. If the Iron Bank's partnership could safeguard these simple moments, then she would endure whatever storm came from the south. Still, the question of Cersei weighed upon her, growing heavier each day. At night, she dreamed of a woman with lion's eyes, a swirling cloak of crimson. She woke with an unsteady heart, for she knew well that the Queen in King's Landing had learned by now of Bravos' decision. If Sansa could guess anything about Cersei Lannister's reaction, it was that it would be swift and laced with fury. Those early days of tenuous quiet were but the calm before the tempest. As Sansa oversaw the day-to-day tasks, the first true sign of trouble arrived in the form of a raven. The bird struggled through an icy wind, landing on the rookery window with exhausted wings. The master of ravens, a stooped man with a kindly face, hurried to bring it inside. The scroll it carried bore a purple seal, a color not often seen in the north. Sansa was summoned from her solar to receive the message. She recognized the seal with a faint furrow of her brow. It belonged to a minor house sworn, in theory, to the crown. She broke it open in the presence of Davos and Brienne. The letter was brief, penned in an agitated scrawl. The author claimed to have overheard talk in King's Landing that the crown had declared new terms for any house suspected of harboring alliances with Bravos. Enforcement was rumored to be heavy-handed. The letter spoke of hush-hush inquiries, of suspicious men asking after Sansa Stark's doings in the north. The tone of the letter betrayed fear. The writer seemed to hope for Sansa's protection if they provided her with this warning. Davos rubbed at his beard, thinking. He pointed out that any open condemnation from the crown would take time to filter north. But this rumor of suspicion indicated that Cersei was already taking steps to isolate or punish Sansa. Brienne stiffened at the mention of potential spies. The tall knight's gaze flicked around, as if every passing servant might be an agent of the Lannisters. Sansa placed the scroll aside with a measured sigh. It was no more than she had expected, but somehow seeing it in ink made her chest tighten. Her decision with the Iron Bank had sealed her fate in the eyes of the Lannisters. She summoned Lady Mormont, who arrived in the great hall with her usual fierce stride. The young woman's presence always stirred a quiet murmur of respect. Despite her youth, she commanded the loyalty of her warriors, and her voice never wavered. Sansa explained the letter's contents, and Lady Mormont responded with the same bluntness that had once shamed older, more seasoned lords. It was time to prepare, she said, for the possibility of a southern threat. The North had always prided itself on resilience, and now they would need it. She advised Sansa to keep an eye on any visitors, to fortify the roads leading to Winterfell, to ensure White Harbor stood ready. Word went out quietly to the other northern houses. No official ravens were sent that might betray panic, but discreet riders carried Sansa's messages, instructing them to stay vigilant, to watch for any sign of Lannister soldiers or banners. They were not to provoke the South, only to keep watch at their borders. The memory of invasions past was too recent. No one wanted another war to ravage their land. The long nights of winter demanded unity and caution, not reckless aggression. Meanwhile, life in King's Landing moved at a dissonant pace. The city, perched on the edge of Blackwater Bay, still bustled with merchants, laborers, and the endless swirl of intrigue. The Red Keep stood high above the fray, its red stone walls capturing the final rays of each sunset. Behind those walls, Cersei Lannister seethed. She received the news of the Iron Bank's slight from Rhaegar himself in the form of a carefully worded note. The slender man had sent word that the bank was withdrawing certain lines of credit from the crown until negotiations could be revisited. It was phrased politely, but the underlying meaning was clear. The Iron Bank had found a more stable investment. The day that Cersei read that letter, she wore a gown of molten gold, the better to intimidate any who ventured into her presence. She did not crumple the parchment or rage openly. She had learned to restrain her reactions when eyes were upon her. Instead, she beckoned Qyburn in a quiet voice. The spy master physician glided into the throne room, flanked by several guards in Lannister crimson. Behind them, the steps to the Iron Throne seemed to loom like a black, spiny beast. Cersei's jaw was set, her face marble pale. She handed Qyburn the letter without a word. He scanned it with cool detachment. "Your Grace," he murmured. "This is a grave disappointment." Cersei stared at him. "Disappointment," she repeated, bitterness creeping into her voice. "I would call it betrayal." She rose from the seat she had taken by the foot of the throne, pacing across the mosaic floor that depicted the seven-pointed star. The swish of her skirts echoed in the hush. "The bank never gave me any reason to suspect they would cast their lot with a Stark girl. Yet here we are." Qyburn set the letter down. "The bank's motivations are transparent enough, Your Grace. They see an opportunity for repayment and stability in the north. Perhaps they imagine that Sansa Stark can command loyalty in a way that unsettles them less than certain southern precarities. There are rumors that the Lannister mines are not what they once were. Rumors that you yourself have had to seize wealth from various houses to sustain the crown." "Dane." Cersei's face twisted. "Does the bank truly believe I cannot repay?" "I have resources. The crown has resources. Braavos forgets itself if it thinks I will meekly accept its desertion." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Send word to our gold cloaks at the city's gates. No Braavosi merchant is to enter or leave King's Landing without being searched. And bring me any news of Braavosi contacts who remain in the city. If the Iron Bank wants to wage this war with parchment, I will not make it easy for them." "B." Qyburn bowed, though his face betrayed no surprise at her instructions. "And what of Winterfell, Your Grace?" She turned sharply, the gold embroidery on her gown flashing in the torchlight. "What of it indeed? We have no direct route to strike them, and the north is well defended by the cold alone. But we can sever their ties, isolate them. Let them choke on their winter. Iron Bank gold or no." He nodded. "I will see to it that we place pressure on any traders who do business with Winterfell, and we will instruct our men along the major roads to hamper the free flow of goods north." "Good." She exhaled, as though forcing her anger to subside. "And watch for any lords or ladies in the crownlands who might grow sympathetic to the north. We cannot have them turn traitor. Remind them of the consequences of betrayal. Do you understand?" Qyburn's thin lips curved in what might have been a smile. "Perfectly, Your Grace." Thus began the Crown's quiet campaign against the north. Letters were sent to lords in the Riverlands, the Vale, and the Crownlands, hinting at Sansa Stark's treasonous dealings with foreign powers. The message was couched in the rhetoric of loyalty to the throne. If Sansa had allied with the Braavosi for gold, was that not a sign she intended to make a bid for independence, or worse, for the Iron Throne? The aim was to sow doubt, to ensure that if the North tried to move southward, it would find no eager allies among the great houses. And for a time the campaign worked. The southern lords, exhausted by the War of the Five Kings, had little desire to rally behind a Stark if it meant another war. Let the North freeze beneath its snow, they thought, while the Crown demanded only peace and fealty. Still, Sansa's name appeared in rumors all across the city. Her resilience, her alleged cunning, her rumored alliance with a great foreign power. These were the talk of taverns in Flea Bottom and of aristocratic gatherings alike. The people had grown weary of Lannister rule. Or so the more daring tongues whispered. If the North was building strength, there were those who welcomed the possibility of new power in the realm. Yet the majority remained silent, remembering how quickly the crown's justice could descend. In Winterfell, Sansa felt the beginnings of Cersei's machinations in subtle ways. First, a merchant caravan, scheduled to arrive from the Riverlands, turned back, sending a terse note that the roads were no longer safe. A letter from a minor lord in the Vale was uncharacteristically curt, denying a trade request on vague grounds. Whispers reached them of small squads of crown-loyal knights checking every shipment that headed north. None of this was catastrophic in the short term. The North could withstand a measure of isolation, especially with the promise of Braavosi funds arriving when the snows allowed. Yet the intent was plain, and it eroded Sansa's peace. She knew that out over time, the crown's strangling tactics could do real damage. She convened a meeting in the library tower, the warm glow of lanterns illuminating shelves lined with ancient tomes. The large windows revealed swirls of snow in the twilight sky. Seated around the long wooden table were Davos Brienne, Lady Mormont, and a scattering of northern lords invited from the surrounding holds. Sansa's face was calm, though her eyes were laced with quiet determination. Davos spoke first, explaining how caravans were being discouraged or outright barred from traveling north. He recounted the rising tensions in the Crownlands. Lady Mormont offered a short, bristling speech about the arrogance of Southerners who thought the North would bow, as if the winter wind could be tamed by mere men. She recommended a show of strength, perhaps dispatching a patrol to escort merchants north to prove the North would defend its trade. An older lord from the eastern moors cleared his throat and expressed concern. If the North openly defied the crown's roadblocks, might that provoke a direct military response? Others chimed in, their voices thick with worry. The North had been battered by war and was still in a fragile state of rebuilding. A full-scale conflict with the crown now would be costly, winter or no. Sansa listened, letting the others weigh their fears and hopes. She thought of her father's unwavering sense of duty, of her mother's protectiveness, of her brother Robb's ill-fated campaign for northern independence. She was determined not to repeat old mistakes. She also recognized that she had a powerful card to play in the Iron Bank. Finally, she lifted a hand to calm the room. We do not wish for open war. Not yet. Our contract with Braavos was made to ensure the North's security through the winter and beyond. We will use it. We can speak with the Iron Bank's agents about securing shipping routes to White Harbor, where the presence of Braavosi ships might deter Crown interference. Let us not forget that once the Braavosi funds arrive, we can finance a small fleet in the north as well. Indorham. Davos nodded thoughtfully. A fleet in the north, he repeated, as though rolling the idea in his mind. It's never been a priority, but it would send a clear message that we can protect our own waters. Braavos might lend us expert shipbuilders. Lady Mormont's eyes gleamed. If we had ships, we could keep the lines of trade open by sea, beyond the crown's reach, at least until the harbors freeze over. Some of the other lords looked uneasy at the notion of openly flaunting naval independence. But Sansa pressed the point gently. We do not seek to provoke, only to defend our right to fair trade. She glanced around. I will send a raven to Rysar or another envoy of the Iron Bank to request assistance in this matter. Their investment in us will be worthless if we cannot receive goods or send them out. Braavos should see the sense in safeguarding our routes. Nemdal. The gathered lords murmured, and eventually agreed. By the meeting's end, it was decided that White Harbor would receive additional funds to strengthen its harbor fortifications, and a small contingent of northern soldiers would patrol the roads leading from the port inland, ensuring that any merchant caravans that did manage to arrive would not be waylaid by Crown loyalists or bandits emboldened by the knowledge that the North stood alone. It was a cautious plan, one that did not overtly challenge the might of King's Landing, yet aimed to carve a path for survival. That night, Sansa wrote to Rhaegar, choosing her words carefully. She addressed him as a partner rather than a benefactor, reminding him that the Iron Bank had pledged support to the North's endeavors. In detail, she recounted how Crown agents were hindering trade. She requested Braavosi assistance with shipping, shipbuilding, and if necessary, escort vessels that might travel up the coast from White Harbor. She refrained from any mention of aggression. She simply spoke of protection for commerce, which the bank would surely want to see continue. She used every ounce of the courtesy and precision she had learned in King's Landing under Cersei's watchful glare. By the time she finished, her writing hand ached, but her resolve felt renewed. Snow continued to pile against the walls over the next several weeks. The sun grew distant and meager. Candles burned longer in the halls, and servants hastened to lay fresh rushes to keep the cold from seeping through the stone floors. Sansa could hear the hushed voices of the staff, all speculating about the future. Would the crown move against them directly? Would the Iron Bank come through on its promises? Did the North stand on the precipice of another long conflict? In King's Landing, Cersei held court with an imperious air. She had taken to wearing heavier furs, as though the northern winter were creeping into her domain. One morning, a fresh rumor reached her ears. A battered merchant from the Riverlands claimed to have encountered a well-guarded caravan heading north, reportedly escorted by men bearing the direwolf sigil. The merchant spoke of how these men had turned away crown inspectors with a curt refusal and had vanished into the snowy roads. This might be nothing more than rumor, but Cersei's temper flared at the suggestion that the North was blatantly disregarding her authority. She summoned Jaime's replacement as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Sir Arden Hall, a serious man with a small, cunning gaze. Cersei demanded to know why such caravans had not been stopped, why the crown's men along the roads had not pressed the issue. Sir Arden hesitated, explaining that the northern caravans traveled in small, tight-knit bands, often choosing roads that wound through remote foothills. The Lannister officials had not expected them to move so swiftly. Cersei snapped that she would not hear excuses, that if the North could supply hidden escorts for caravans, the crown had better find a means to intercept them. She considered for a moment an outright call for arms, but the memory of how tenuous her hold on the city's funds truly was made her pause. Open war would be costly. Soldiers needed pay, provisions, and more. With the Iron Bank's support withdrawn, the crown found itself tightening its purse strings more than ever before. Her advisors cautioned her that a full military campaign against the North in deep winter would be disastrous. That knowledge only fueled her frustration. She turned to Qyburn, who stood at her side like a silent shade. "What does your network tell us of the Braavosi?" she asked in a low voice. He bowed his head. "They continue to operate discreetly. Some of their representatives have left the city, presumably to carry new terms or instructions from Rysar. We do not know precisely how many remain in King's Landing." She clenched her jaw. "We will find them, and we will make it clear that Braavos stands on the wrong side if it dares to undermine the crown." Dao? Cersei's every breath seethed with a longing for retribution. Her posture was rigid, her hands curled against the arms of the chair in which she sat. But she forced herself to remain calm. She had endured more than one challenge to her authority, and each time she had found a way to survive. The North would be no different, even if it was led by that red-haired wisp of a girl who had once cowered in the halls of the Red Keep. Cersei's mind teemed with memories of Sansa's fearful gaze back when Joffrey toyed with her. A savage satisfaction flickered in the queen's chest. She had not forgotten the way she could break an enemy, be it physically or psychologically. She dismissed her counsel and paced in solitude at the foot of the Iron Throne. The throne's high back caught the torchlight, the swords hammered into its metal glinting darkly. She recalled her father's words, "Only the fools start a war they cannot finish." But then, only the fools sat idle while their foes gathered strength. The puzzle twisted in her thoughts. The tension between her hatred and her caution formed a knot she could not easily unravel. Even as Cersei wrestled with her dilemma, Rysar's reply reached Winterfell. Sansa received it in her private solar, perched on a window seat to catch the weak winter light as she read. The Braavosi envoy confirmed that the Iron Bank would honor the contract they had drawn, offering to dispatch a modest escort of Braavosi ships to White Harbor before the sea turned too perilous. Additionally, they offered an introduction to certain shipwrights in the Free Cities who could journey to the north come spring to help expand the fledgling northern fleet. The letter exuded the detached politeness Sansa had come to expect from Rysar, but she sensed a genuine willingness in his words. The Iron Bank wanted trade to flow, and so they would facilitate it. A wave of relief spread through her. She summoned the few lords who oversaw White Harbor's defenses, instructing them to anticipate Braavosi arrivals. She made arrangements for more frequent patrols. She also took the precaution of sending a few trusted individuals into the coastal villages to gather news, to ensure no crown agents lurked there, planning sabotage. As the days passed, she felt the first tremors of a new sense of possibility. If White Harbor could become a haven for commerce protected by Braavosi ships, the North might outlast even a prolonged siege on its roads. Yet the specter of conflict loomed. One afternoon, after an icy morning spent reviewing storehouses, Sansa retreated to her solar and found Brienne waiting by the hearth, her posture taut. Sansa's stomach lurched at the sight. Brienne's expression, though stoic, conveyed urgent news. She wasted no time. A rider had come bearing word from a contact near the neck. Men in Lannister colors had been spotted patrolling those southern swamps, questioning anyone who traveled north about the Starks, about caravans, about possible Iron Bank agents. They wore no official banners of war, but their presence was clearly more than idle curiosity. They were preparing for something. Sansa sat in a carved wooden chair, gazing at the knight who stood so gravely before her. She felt a swirl of fear and anger gather in her chest. "So they are sending men into the neck," she said at last. "The swamps may delay them, but if they choose to push farther, what then? They could try to set up blockades along the King's Road, strangle the last route of trade by land." Brienne nodded. "We should prepare for that possibility. If enough Lannister soldiers fortify Moat Cailin or nearby, they might effectively cut off travel. Their force would need to be sizable, but even a smaller group of skilled fighters could make passage difficult for merchants." Then Sansa thought of how, not so long ago, the Boltons had used Moat Cailin to keep the Ironborn from marching deeper into the north. She clenched her fists at the memory of the Boltons' cruelty. Now it seemed the Lannisters might apply the same ruthless strategy, but she refused to panic. She asked Brienne to gather what reliable information she could, and to quietly muster a small force of northern soldiers who might discreetly move south to watch the neck from the northern side. Sansa did not want to spark an outright confrontation, but she also had no intention of letting Lannister troops roam unchallenged. The next day, as she stood on the ramparts with the wind tugging at her cloak, she gazed out into the snowy distance. The sky glowed a luminous gray, and the cold bit at her face, but she found clarity in that starkness. She had always known that forging an alliance with the Iron Bank would place her on a collision course with Cersei. She had chosen this path because she believed it was the only way to safeguard the North. Now, with winter's breath chilling the stones of Winterfell, she resolved that she would not falter. In King's Landing, the undercurrents of discontent continued to swirl beneath Cersei's rule. The city streets, filled with the usual rancor of the poor, the restless, the uneasy. Flea Bottom stewed in rumors that the crown was running out of coin. Broadsheets appeared in the night, posted to walls or left on tavern tables, proclaiming that the queen was strangling the city's future with taxes and fear. No one knew who penned these messages, though Cersei suspected the Braavosi might be subtly fueling the dissent. She had the gold cloaks tear down the broadsheets wherever they found them, arresting any who seemed to stand near them too long. She retreated more often to her private chambers, sometimes staring at the city below by candlelight. The stillness of the city at night contrasted with her own restless mind. She sipped wine, more than she once had, and felt the old bitterness burn in her throat. She recalled a time when her father Tywin would have marched on the north without hesitation. But Tywin was gone, the Lannister forces depleted, and the crown's coffers dangerously light. She felt the walls closing in, an unfamiliar sensation of helplessness. That was not to say she had no power left, only that it was more precarious than at any point she could remember. In the midst of this tension, a second Braavosi ship arrived at King's Landing. Its sails bore no overt sign, yet word spread that its captain was seeking audience with the crown. Cersei, suspicious but intrigued, allowed an audience in the small hall. The Braavosi captain arrived in fine silks, wearing rings of polished jet on his slender fingers. He bowed low, introduced himself as Farrago of the Painted Sails Trading Company, and claimed that he came to discuss the crown's outstanding debts with Braavos, as well as potential renegotiations. At first, Cersei hid her skepticism, greeting him coolly. In the presence of the small council, she sat upon a smaller seat that nonetheless towered above the Braavosi visitor, who stood in the center of the hall's marble floor. He spoke of possibilities, that if the crown demonstrated its good faith by paying at least a portion of the overdue sums, the Iron Bank might reconsider fully severing ties. He assured her that the bank had not abandoned King's Landing outright. His voice dripped with practiced politeness, yet Cersei could sense the emptiness behind it. She demanded specifics. He offered none. He couched every statement in conditional phrases. If the crown could provide adequate collateral, if the crown would open new trade concessions to Braavosi merchants, if the crown could guarantee that it would not persecute Braavosi agents who remained in the city. Each stipulation twisted the knife deeper. It was obvious that if Cersei agreed to these terms, the crown would be entangled in more debt, and the Braavosi would gain freedoms she loathed to grant. In her mind, she saw the cunning plan. The Iron Bank still favored Sansa, but they wished to keep every door open, milking advantage from both sides. Such was the Braavosi way. She dismissed the captain with non-committal phrases, telling him she would confer with her council. As he bowed and withdrew, she eyed him with thinly veiled contempt. The moment the doors closed behind him, she turned to Qyburn and demanded to know if the Painted Sails Trading Company had any documented ties to Rhaegar. Qyburn promised to investigate. In the silence that followed, Cersei felt the old rage build, at the Iron Bank's audacity, at Sansa Stark's presumption, at the precariousness of her own throne. Once again, the vision of a red-haired girl rose in her mind, no longer the frightened bird, but a young wolf with cunning eyes, forging alliances in the frigid north. Cersei's lips thinned. She vowed that no matter what brazen moves the Starks made, the crown would not yield. Days turned to weeks, and the tension simmered. In Winterfell, each passing dawn found Sansa receiving news from scattered corners of the north. A few caravans had indeed made it through the swamps, with minimal interference, escorted by small groups of northern soldiers. The roads were difficult, the weather punishing, but trade was not entirely strangled yet. More promising was the Raven from White Harbor, announcing the first Braavosi ship had arrived, and was now anchored offshore, bearing supplies of grain, dried fish, and sundry goods. The letter from the harbor master described the event with cautious optimism, stating that the Braavosi captain insisted on the fair terms previously negotiated with Rhaegar. Sansa felt a spark of hope reading those lines. The wheels of partnership had begun to turn. Still, beyond the castle walls, the snows thickened. Deep drifts formed in the courtyards. The nights grew longer, the darkness more pervasive. Lanterns glowed in every tower window, and the flicker of torchlight danced in the corners of the great hall. The north seemed wrapped in a silent hush, like a vast creature slumbering beneath ice, ready to awaken if stirred too violently. Sansa could sense the quiet tension in the halls, in the watchful eyes of the guards who stood by the gates at all hours, breath steaming in the frozen air. One evening, a scout returned from a journey south of Moat Cailin, half frozen and weary, but bearing troubling news. He described how he had seen small encampments of men in Lannister livery, spaced out along the old causeway. They were not numerous, but they had watchtowers and signals arranged, so that if a caravan tried to pass unescorted, the men could harass or turn it back. The scout believed these outposts were newly established, likely the first wave of a larger plan to control the next passes. Sansa's gaze darkened. She gathered her advisors, Davos, Brienne, Lady Mormont, and a handful of other key figures, and relayed this information. The conversation that followed was grim. If the crown solidified its hold on the neck, they might starve the north of supplies by land. The eastern sea route was an option, thanks to Braavos. But there were many goods that traveled most easily over land, especially from the riverlands. The North's lifeline would be all but severed if the blockade grew stronger. Winter's grip tightened with each passing day, and while the Braavosi gold was promised, coin alone would not keep men from freezing, nor feed them if shipments were blocked on all fronts. Lady Mormont rose from her chair. Her small hands clenched. She declared that a show of force was necessary, that the North must not let Lannisters entrench themselves at Moat Cailin. Davos, more cautious, pointed out that an open skirmish might be just the excuse Cersei needed to declare all-out war. Brienne agreed that confrontation should be avoided, if at all possible. But neither she nor Davos had a clear solution for how to remove the Lannister presence without bloodshed. Sansa listened in silence, turning the problem over in her mind. "We must not rush," she said at last, her tone measured. "It is true that open battle in the Neck could spiral into a war. We cannot afford to let that happen in the depths of winter, unless there is no alternative. But neither can we allow the crown to sit at our gates uncontested." She explained that they would need to pursue a more subtle course. Men loyal to the crown might be susceptible to bribes or negotiations. Perhaps some could be persuaded to leave the Neck if they feared the coming cold or believed the crown's coffers were too empty to pay them. Alternatively, certain sections of the swamp could be made impassable, starving out the Lannister outposts. It was risky, requiring cunning and a delicate hand, but Sansa refused to simply charge forward with swords. She was no longer the starry-eyed child who believed knights were the only answer to conflict. She had learned that some battles were best won with words and maneuvering. So it was that she dispatched a handful of skilled envoys southward, men and women who could speak with the riverfolk, glean intelligence, perhaps even spread rumors that the crown was wavering, that the Lannister men in the Neck would find no reward for their efforts. Others were tasked with scouting the swamplands for ways to misdirect or impede the crown's supply lines. If the Lannister outposts could not be fed, they would not last long in the bitter chill. Sansa did not relish such tactics, but she saw them as necessary to protect her people. In King's Landing, the mood continued to sour. The painted sails captain reported back to the Iron Bank that the crown was non-committal, perhaps even hostile, to the idea of renegotiation. The gold cloaks began to clamp down further on Braavosi merchants, forcing many to quietly slip away. Cersei struggled to maintain the illusion of control, hosting lavish feasts in the Red Keep whenever possible, though the actual fare was diminished from the days of plenty. She drank more wine, listening to sycophantic lords proclaim their unwavering support, even as her spies whispered that some were growing uneasy at the crown's rising debt. She thought often of how best to break the north without committing her armies to a doomed winter campaign. The blockade at the Neck was a start, but she wanted to be certain it remained invisible to the other great houses. She had her riders deliver messages to the lords of the Riverlands, framing the Lannister presence as mere protection against bandits. The unsuspecting might accept that explanation for a time, but she knew that to truly crush Sansa's rebellion, if rebellion it was, she might need a more decisive blow. Thus the stage was set, tension building in the spaces between each breath. The North worked quietly, forging alliances and trade routes beneath the falling snow. The Crown's agents lurked in the swamps, stifling land travel, all while feigning innocence. The Iron Bank, looking on from across the sea, calculated profits and arranged deals, content to let their two largest prospective clients maneuver for advantage. In the midst of it all, winter deepened, a relentless force that cared nothing for crowns or banners. Sansa felt the weight of those encroaching shadows, yet she also felt a current of determination coursing through the men and women around her. This was the North. These were her people, and she would not abandon them to Cersei's cruelty. Each day, she tended to the tasks at hand, inspiring unity among the lords, dispensing fairness where she could. If the North stood united, she believed, it might outlast whatever schemes the crown devised. She could almost feel the presence of her ancestors, those who had endured countless winters before her, urging her onward. And so the snow fell, layer upon layer, muffling the echoes of old wars. The wolves of the winter prowled along the walls at night, their howls riding the wind, piercing and sure. Above the highest battlements of Winterfell, the banner of the direwolf rippled and snapped, unbowed by the gusts. And far away, in a red keep flickering with torchlight, a lioness paced in her cage of golden steel, plotting her next move. The game was in motion, and the fate of realms might hinge upon which side the winter would favor. Sansa, standing alone at a frosted window, allowed a single quiet breath to escape her lips, visible as a wisp in the cold. She would not bow, not to Cersei, not to the illusions of fear. The North was her charge, and if the Iron Bank had chosen her, she would make sure the realm felt that choice reverberate. Hey. Dawn broke over Winterfell in a wan gleam of white and gray. The kind of pale winter sunrise that scarcely managed to push the night's shadows from the castle walls. Snow blanketed every tower and parapet, and a frigid wind rattled the shutters. Sansa woke early as she had for weeks, unrested but unwilling to linger in bed. She rose from her furs, donned a warm gown in stark gray, and moved through the corridors by lamplight. The servants she passed offered quiet bows. They had grown accustomed to finding her awake at odd hours, peering at ledgers or lost in thought by a window. Down in the great hall, the fireplaces crackled, their flames licking at the soot-blackened stones. A handful of courtiers and minor lords warmed themselves at the hearth, cups of hot ale in hand. They murmured greetings as Sansa approached, but their voices remained hushed, as though they feared disturbing the hush of winter. She offered them a gentle, if somewhat distant, nod. Her mind already roamed ahead, planning the day's tasks, weighing the newest threads of information that had filtered in from the Neck and the port at White Harbor. She found Davos waiting near the dais, near one of the long tables set for the morning meal. He stood close to the fire, his cloak draped over one arm, a battered ledger tucked beneath the other. At her approach, he inclined his head, that faint fatherly warmth in his eyes. She took a seat, and he joined her, placing the ledger on the table, so that its worn pages fanned open. It was a record of goods that had come north by sea, mostly Braavosi shipments. The numbers were nowhere near the bounty the North would have liked, but it was a trickle that kept them going. "We have another ship scheduled to arrive at White Harbor within the fortnight," Davos said in a soft, measured voice. "If the storms don't turn them back, they should bring salt fish, grains, and some building materials. Not a large shipment, but more than we'd managed from the south just now." Sansa nodded. "Even a little helps. The roads grow worse by the day, and if the Lannisters continue to station their men near Moat Cailin, we'll see no caravans for months." Davos exhaled, his breath fogging slightly in the chill of the hall. That's the grim truth of it." He ran a calloused finger across one of the columns in the ledger, his brows drawing together. "We've done what we can to keep the southern roads passable on our side, but I suspect the Crown's men are making the journey too risky for most merchants. There is little profit in traveling half-frozen swamps only to be harassed at every turn." Sansa's mouth tightened into a line. She suppressed the prickle of unease that threatened to creep over her. "The Braavosi have promised more direct support come spring. Even so, I'll not have us entirely dependent on them. If Cersei doubles her efforts to choke our trade, we'll need to rely on every spare measure of farmland and every storehouse." "Nabdurhadi." He gave a small, grave nod. "Indeed. I'll send word again to Lady Glover and others in the western holds. Make sure they're well stocked. If we share resources carefully, we'll endure." The faint scrape of boots on stone announced Brienne's arrival. She came up behind them, tall as ever, a reassuring presence in her gleaming mail. She did not wear her cloak indoors, yet the cold barely seemed to touch her. She inclined her head to Sansa and gave Davos a respectful nod. "Any word from our scouts?" Sansa asked, turning in her seat to face Brienne. "Have they reported further changes in the Lannister encampments?" Brienne adjusted the hilt of her sword, an unconscious gesture. "Only that the men in the Neck remain vigilant. We've not heard of any large-scale reinforcements arriving, but they seem well supplied for the moment. They have small patrols combing the causeway, questioning travelers. Our scouts maintain distance, avoiding direct encounters." "Zammer." Sansa's stomach sank at the news, though she had expected no sudden miracle. "Let them keep out of sight. We need eyes there, not a provocation." Brienne nodded. "They understand. I've also relayed your instructions to quietly disrupt any local sources of supply for the Lannisters. If a few fishing villages or traveling merchants find reason to refuse them provisions, we might weaken their hold." Sansa allowed herself a thin smile. Sometimes a war is won on an empty belly. Then she rose, tugging her heavy cloak tighter around her shoulders. "Come with me, both of you. I'd like to see the day's bread rations. We need to confirm the supply counts for ourselves." They left the great hall for the storerooms beneath the castle, where the air hung thick with the smell of grain and old hay. Torches flickered in iron sconces, casting dancing shadows across the barrels and sacks stacked against the walls. Servants bustled to and fro, taking inventory, marking tallies on wax tablets. Sansa moved among them, occasionally murmuring a question or pausing to run her hand across a barrel's lid. She needed to feel a tangible sense of the North's resources, to anchor herself in something concrete amid the swirl of rumor and worry. Davos trailed behind, flipping the ledger pages, comparing her storehouse tallies to the Braavosi shipments that had already arrived. The numbers weren't perfect, but for now, the math worked. They would survive a good while, if the blockade in the neck didn't worsen. Brienne stood watchful, as if an ambush might lurk behind a stack of flour sacks. The tall knight took her duties to heart, especially after so many years of hardship that had befallen Sansa. When they finished, Sansa excused the servants with a kind word, telling them to continue their work. She, Davos, and Brienne lingered in the dim corridor outside. A swirl of cold air drifted down the steps that led back to the courtyard. Sansa looked between them, her expression resolute. "I want to push forward the plan to gather new recruits for the Northern Guard," she said. "We've many scattered soldiers who might be willing to serve if we could equip them properly. The Crown's blockade might remain half-hearted, or it might swell in size. We must be prepared." "Nay." Davos glanced at Brienne, then back at Sansa. "We'll need arms, and the blacksmiths can only do so much before their supplies run thin. The Braavosi shipments help, but..." Sansa raised a hand. "I'm aware. I've sent word to Rysar about the possibility of bringing more iron and steel from the Free Cities. He said it could be arranged, though it will take time. For now, if we can't outfit everyone with the best steel, we'll at least ensure they have spears and leathers. 100 well-trained spearmen can hold off a larger force if they stand on northern ground." Brienne shifted. "We must ensure they're truly loyal. Desperate men can be swayed by southern gold or fear. If we gather too many untested fighters, some might betray us. Then we choose carefully," Sansa replied. "We rely on the loyal houses first. Mormont, Glover, Serwyn, Manderley, and so forth. We train up young men who have proven themselves, and we treat them well. We'll make them see that the North stands together." Davos' voice held a note of caution. "Even so, loyalty is fickle when hunger sets in. We must keep morale high, remind them of why we do this." Sansa touched the embroidered wolf's head on her cloak, feeling the raised thread under her fingertips. "We do this because we are Stark, and the North has bled enough for southern wars. I'll not leave my people vulnerable to another Lannister cruelty. So long as we stand, the Crown will know it cannot break us." They parted ways for the moment, each going about their assigned tasks. Sansa returned above ground to the library tower, seeking an hour's quiet to compose letters. She wrote to the lords of smaller keeps, to the Flints and the Locks, reminding them of their duty. She wrote to the Manderleys at White Harbor, praising their vigilance and urging them to keep the new Braavosi arrivals' content well guarded against sabotage. Her quill scratched across parchment, her breath forming small puffs in the cold chamber. By the time she finished, her hand felt cramped, but she knew these letters mattered. Each sealed missive was a stitch in the tapestry of alliances that might hold the North together. That evening, she found a moment alone in the Godswood. Snow drifted across the ancient trees, clinging to the bare branches in clumps of ice. The weirwood's face stared with its bleached white eyes, red sap tears frozen against the bark. Sansa approached slowly, pulling her cloak tight. The quiet here felt deeper than anywhere else in Winterfell, as though the old gods themselves held the wind at bay. She closed her eyes, remembering her father's voice, the soft rumble of it when he prayed in this very grove. Ned Stark's memory lay in these stones and roots. It gave her strength, yet it also reminded her how swiftly good people could be struck down. She sank to her knees in the snow, ignoring the cold seeping through her skirts, and bowed her head. She was not certain what words she meant to speak, only that she wished to find solace in that ancient presence. She thought of how the Iron Bank's gold might reshape the North's fate. She thought of Cersei, coiled in the Red Keep, sipping wine and plotting. She thought of the men in the Neck, blocking roads, and of the merchant ships forging paths across the icy sea. Fear pressed like a weight on her lungs, but in the hush of the godswood, she summoned resolve, letting it fill every breath. A scattering of snow fell across her shoulders, and she eventually rose, blinking against the icy flakes. Night had nearly fallen by then, the gray sky dimming to smoky purple. She turned and left the godswood, passing through the archway that led back into the courtyard. The torches had been lit, their flames guttering in the wintry gusts. The castle was preparing to settle in for another cold night. She took a light supper in the small hall. The cooks had prepared thick stew, warm bread, and spiced wine. She forced herself to eat, aware that her appetite had waned in these tense weeks, but mindful that she had to keep her strength. 2 men from the Serwyn house joined her at table, updating her on a fresh group of laborers they had set to clearing old farmland. Sansa encouraged them, praising their initiative. She wanted each house to feel vital to the North's resurgence, to see themselves as part of a whole, rather than scattered pieces. If war did come, it was unity that would save them. After supper, she climbed the steps to her chambers, intending to retire early and gather what rest she could. But as she stepped into the corridor, a page hurried toward her, breath puffing in the chill air. He bowed quickly and said that a raven had arrived, marked urgent, bearing the Braavosi seal. Sansa dismissed him with quiet thanks, her heart already thudding as she hastened to the small table beneath a flickering lantern. The scroll bore a neat, understated seal. She cracked it open and recognized Ryshar's careful handwriting. He wrote from Braavos itself, having returned there after finalizing initial arrangements in Westeros. The letter was lengthy but succinct in tone. He acknowledged the North's precarious position. He confirmed that the Iron Bank's board members had approved further investment in the form of ships and supplies, which would be dispatched to White Harbor at intervals throughout the coming season. Some might even arrive if the weather on the Narrow Sea held. But Rhysar added a note of caution. There were rumors that the Crown was considering moves to seize Braavosi assets in Westeros outright, to hold them hostage unless the Iron Bank withdrew support from the North. It was uncertain if Cersei would act on this threat, given her limited funds. But Rhysar wanted Sansa to be aware that the bank was caught in a delicate dance with King's Landing. Sansa felt a stab of both relief and alarm. The Iron Bank's support was indeed growing, but Cersei's anger would not dissipate. It was entirely likely that the Queen would lash out in some way, perhaps even attempt to raid the next ships that came into White Harbor if she could muster a fleet. Fortunately, the Crown's own naval power had long been overshadowed by other houses, and the aftereffects of recent wars had left their forces scattered. Still, desperation could lead to surprising feats. She read on, noticing that Rhysar also mentioned a shift in Braavos' internal politics. Some influential magisters questioned investing further in Westeros, worried that a drawn-out conflict might drain the bank's resources. Others saw an opportunity for tremendous profit if the North prevailed. Rhysar implied that he was aligned with the latter faction and would continue to champion Sansa's cause, but she should remain mindful that the Iron Bank was no stranger to changing loyalties if a venture grew too risky or unprofitable. It was a cold reminder that Braavos was no true friend. They were partners of convenience. Still, partnership was better than isolation. She finished reading, rolled up the scroll, and handed it off to one of her sentries with instructions to keep it safe. By now, the weariness in her bones was acute. She climbed the final steps to her chambers, letting her ladies-in-waiting help her out of her cloak and boots. She thanked them and shut the door on the world outside, determined to snatch at least a few hours of rest before the next day's burdens reclaimed her. Yet, sleep came fitfully. She tossed on her feather bed, half dreaming of old horrors. A cackling Joffrey brandishing a crossbow, a Bolton with cruel eyes, the Red Keep's corridors swirling with shadows. She awoke with a gasp just before dawn, her heart pounding. Her furs had slid halfway to the floor. The brazier's coals were almost spent, leaving the chamber's air chilled. She drew a quavering breath and rose, deciding she'd find no more solace in restless dreams. She dressed herself, pulling on a heavy gown and lacing it with shaking fingers. Then she made her way into the corridors once more, traversing the winding steps until she emerged on one of the battlements. The view of Winterfell's courtyard spread out below her, faintly lit by the earliest glimmer of dawn. Snow draped every surface like a muffling blanket. Torches here and there glowed like tiny beacons, flickering in the wind. She lingered at the parapet, lost in thought. As the horizon began to lighten, the iron-gray sky shifting toward a clouded pink, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting perhaps a guard, but found Brienne, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak. The knight inclined her head in greeting. Sansa motioned for her to join her at the wall. They stood side by side, gazing out at the sweep of white hills beyond the castle. Brienne spoke in a low voice. "My lady, I wanted to tell you. Some new arrivals came late in the night. They wear no southern colors, claimed to be traveling merchants, yet I've asked them to remain in the courtyard under guard." "Aye." Sansa's brow arched. "You suspect they're spies?" "It's possible. We can't be too careful. Shall I question them further, or would you prefer to speak with them directly?" Sansa pressed her lips together, thinking. If these travelers were indeed merchants, it would be a misstep to treat them with hostility. But the crown could easily dispatch men disguised as peddlers to glean intelligence or stir trouble. "Let me speak to them," she said finally. "Have them brought to the small hall after breakfast. I'll see what they have to say. If they're legitimate, we'll offer them hospitality. If not, I'll have them escorted from the castle." Brienne nodded, relief in her eyes. "Of course, I'll oversee the arrangements." She hesitated, then added, "The times are difficult, my lady. Too much suspicion could breed paranoia, but too little could be fatal." Sansa touched her arm lightly. "I know. We must find a balance, or we lose ourselves." She glanced out at the snowy vista again. "Winter is already harsh enough. We don't need fear to make it worse." And after breakfast, Sansa waited in the small hall. A space less formal than the great hall, but still large enough to hold a gathering of a few dozen people. The fire burned in a wide hearth, pushing back the worst of the morning chill. Davos stood off to one side, arms folded. Brienne positioned herself near the door, one hand resting on the pommel of her sword. Two northern guards flanked the entrance. At length the door opened, and in walked three figures. Their cloaks were patched and dusty from travel. They moved with cautious steps, as if uncertain of the reception they would receive. Their leader was a woman of middling years. Her hair braided back tightly, a travel-stained tunic visible beneath her fur cloak. She carried no visible weapon, though Sansa noticed a short blade sheathed at her hip. The two men with her appeared older, stooped from what might have been a lifetime of merchant labor. They glanced around, their eyes flicking from the guards to Davos to Brienne, and finally settling on Sansa, who stood at the head of the hall. Sansa gestured for them to come closer. "Welcome to Winterfell," she said, her tone neither welcoming nor hostile, merely careful. "I hear you arrived late last night. Might I know your names and your purpose here?" The woman inclined her head in a bow that was respectful, if not particularly deep. "My lady, I am Jaren of the Wester Road. These two are my uncles, Thamur and Garrett. We travel with spices, dried fruit, odds and ends from the Riverlands. We were hoping to sell our goods in the north, maybe even to the castle. The road south grew difficult, so we came to Winterfell." "Nimar." Sansa studied her closely. The woman's face bore weathered lines, her posture hinting at a certain wariness. "What difficulties did you meet on the roads?" Jaren pressed her lips together. "We encountered men who claimed to speak for the crown. They demanded our business, our cargo. We told them we meant no harm, but they forced us to pay a toll, a high toll. They said they were protecting travelers from bandits. Didn't feel much like protection to me." She glanced at her uncles, who both nodded in silent agreement. Sansa exchanged a glance with Davos, who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "And how did you come to the castle itself? The winter roads aren't kind this year." "We had a guide," Jaren replied, a bit more boldly. "A local huntsman who traveled the area. Paid him what coin we could spare to lead us around the worst drifts. We arrived around midnight, found the gates heavily guarded. We mean no trouble, my lady. Only trade, if you'll allow it." "If you'll allow it." Sansa let the silence stretch, observing their expressions. The older men shifted, clearly ill at ease. Jaren held her ground more steadily, but her eyes flicked once to Brienne's sword. At length, Sansa spoke softly. "If you are honest merchants, I see no reason to turn you away. If you have goods to sell, the North will buy, provided the prices are fair. But know this, if you are not what you claim, if you carry any ill will toward Winterfell." The woman shook her head, her voice tight with urgency. "I swear it on the Seven, we've no reason to harm this castle, nor can we afford to. We're simple folk." Sansa believed them, or at least believed they were not obvious Lannister agents. This was precisely the sort of difficulty that the Crown's blockade along the neck had created. Merchants forced to scrape by, traveling treacherous paths with no guarantee of safety. She offered a small, cool smile. "Very well, you may sell your wares in the courtyard. My steward will arrange a spot for you. You'll have the protection of Winterfell while you're here. But mind our rules. Do not roam the castle unescorted." Relief washed over their faces. Thamar and Garrod both bobbed clumsy bows, and Jaren managed a more controlled dip of her head. "Thank you, my lady. You won't regret it." They turned to depart, guided by one of the guards. When the door closed, Davos let out a low breath. "They seem genuine enough, and we can always use new supplies." Brienne nodded, though she remained vigilant. "Let's keep them within sight. If they're telling the truth, they'll appreciate the safety. If not, they'll reveal themselves soon enough." Sansa lingered in the small hall, running a hand along the back of a carved wooden chair. The presence of these ragged merchants gave her a moment of perspective. People were still trying to eke out a life in the shadow of winter and political strife. Not everyone belonged to the great houses or was a piece in the Crown's game. Many were simply hoping to survive. She felt a flicker of responsibility, a reminder that leadership meant caring for the humble as well as thwarting the mighty. She excused Brienne to carry on her rounds and asked Davos to accompany her to her solar for further discussion. Once inside, she latched the door and motioned for Davos to sit. The room was modest, warmed by a brazier, with thick tapestries depicting direwolves adorning the walls. Sansa settled behind her small wooden desk, leaning forward with her elbows propped on its surface. "I'm concerned that the Crown might escalate," she said softly. "We see only these petty tolls and small outposts now. But if Cersei grows more desperate, she might send larger forces or try to strong-arm the Riverlords into cutting us off entirely." Davos finished for her. "Hey, it's a risk." Sansa twisted the signet ring on her finger, the metal cold against her skin. "We've been playing a waiting game, quietly fortifying our position. But there may come a time when we have to act more decisively. If the Iron Bank is correct, and Cersei wants to seize Braavosi assets, that could be her next move. I want us to be ready." Davos tapped his fingers on the desk's edge. "A direct conflict with the Crown still worries me. But if she tries something rash, we'll have no choice. The North must stand firm. We can't let King's Landing treat us like wayward children. Not again." "Betrossen and Dow." Sansa's eyes flicked to the window, through which she could see flecks of snow swirling in the gray sky. She thought of her father, who had once believed in the goodness of the realm, only to be betrayed. She thought of Robb, whose quest for justice had ended in heartbreak. She had no illusions now. "Let her come," she said quietly. "If the Lannisters want to fling themselves against the North in the heart of winter, let them find out how harsh the cold can be. We'll bleed them until they regret underestimating us." Davos gave a grim nod. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that, for everyone's sake." They spent the next while reviewing messages from White Harbor, each letter detailing the progress of the Braavosi shipments. Some had been hindered by storms. Others needed to wait off the coast for calmer seas before offloading their cargo. But bit by bit, goods were trickling in. The Manderleys seemed amenable to granting the Braavosi certain privileges in exchange for continued support, a move that aligned well with Sansa's contract. If the North could secure enough resources to last the winter, they could reevaluate their position in the spring, perhaps even begin building those ships Rhaegar had alluded to. After Davos departed, Sansa remained at her desk, rubbing her temples against a gathering headache. The days felt long, each step forward threatened by new complications. How had her father balanced duty with the burden of watchfulness? She admired him all the more now, recalling how she had once only seen him as a kind face, never recognizing the weight that must have pressed upon him. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. One of her ladies-in-waiting, a girl named Jean, who had grown up in Winterfell's kitchens, entered with a shy curtsy. She carried a small tray bearing a steaming cup of tea. "Forgive me, my lady," she said in a hushed voice. "I thought you might like something warm." Sansa offered her a grateful smile. "You have impeccable timing, Jane. Thank you." She accepted the tea and inhaled its herbal aroma, letting the warmth seep into her hands. "How are you faring today?" The girl's cheeks flushed. "Well enough, my lady. Just tired of all this cold." She glanced around the solar as though searching for something else to say, then ventured, "Is it true that merchants came in the night? People are talking?" Sansa sipped her tea, nodding. "They did. They're setting up in the courtyard now. Perhaps you'll find something interesting among their wares. Just be sure to keep your wits. These are uncertain times." "Yes, my lady," Jane replied with another small curtsy. Her eyes shone with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She departed quietly, closing the door behind her. Sansa felt a pang, recalling when she herself had once been that young, full of questions and hopes. The innocence of youth had burned away under the harsh realities of the last few years. She drank her tea in slow, thoughtful sips. Then she rose, determined not to drown in her own uncertainties. She would do what must be done, day by day, until the realm's storms passed, or she had no breath left to draw. That afternoon, she made a point of wandering the courtyard to observe the merchant's stall. Jaren had laid out small casks of spices, dried fruits, and even a few bolts of cloth she claimed came from the Riverlands. A handful of castle staff perused the wares, drawn by the novelty. Sansa watched from a short distance, Brienne at her side, taking note of how Jaren interacted with potential customers. Friendly, courteous, possibly desperate for a sale. She saw no sign of subterfuge, no suspicious glances that might suggest hidden motives. The uncles mostly kept in the background, handling the goods while Jaren negotiated. If this was a ruse, it was a subtle one indeed. She moved on, strolling along the courtyard's perimeter. The cold bit at her cheeks, and she drew her cloak tighter. Everywhere she looked, she saw people going about their tasks with quiet determination. Blacksmiths laboring at the forges, stable hands brushing down the shaggy northern horses, castle guards patrolling with spears in hand. A sense of unity suffused the air, a shared understanding that in these times, every person had a role to play. Winter did not permit laziness or frivolity. At the southwestern corner of the courtyard, she found Lady Mormont overseeing a handful of her Bear Sigil warriors. The young leader wore thick furs, her fierce eyes scanning the men who practiced their drills with axes and short swords. She turned as Sansa approached, offering a curt nod. "Lady Stark," she said in her usual forthright manner. "We're training these lads to guard the walls. Some are new recruits from the smaller villages." Sansa studied them with an appraising gaze. They were of varying ages, some not much older than Jane, others grizzled from years of labor. Their weapons work was decent, but unrefined. Still, they had the spark of determination in their eyes. "They look capable," Sansa remarked. "I'm glad to see more of our people stepping forward." Lady Mormont crossed her arms. "They're eager to prove themselves. The Mormonts have always believed that one brave soldier can be worth 10 cowards. Train them right, and they'll serve well." Sansa watched the men block and parry. Snowflakes eddied around them. Their breath mingled in the cold air, each exhale a ghostly cloud. "Have we heard any news from your scouts near the neck?" she asked quietly. "Brienne's informed me that the situation remains unchanged, but I value every set of eyes." "They returned this morning," Lady Mormont replied. "The Lannister outposts remain small, but the men are well armed, well organized. It seems they're preparing for something, though we can't say what. They don't appear to be marching north, not yet." Sansa nodded. "We'll continue to keep watch. The moment they try anything rash, we need to be ready to respond." Lady Mormont's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Do you anticipate a direct confrontation soon?" "I'm ready if it comes to that. My warriors hunger for a chance to remind Southerners the North is not to be trifled with." Sansa considered the question. I cannot say for certain. Cersei might hesitate to commit troops in winter. But if she thinks we're vulnerable, she might gamble. For now, all we can do is hold our ground, gather strength and keep the lines of trade open. If we can last until spring, the advantage is ours. The young woman's face hardened with a mix of eagerness and resolve. Then we'll keep training. We'll not let the crown treat us like a beggar state. She offered a brief, respectful bow, then turned to bark orders at the men, who resumed their drills with renewed fervor. Sansa left them to their training, her thoughts swirling. She was grateful for Lady Mormont's fierce loyalty, but she also recognized the danger of letting that fierce pride transform into reckless aggression. All it would take was one ill-timed strike against the Lannister outposts, and Cersei could claim that the North was the aggressor. Then the trickle of support from the southern lords, thin though it was, might vanish entirely. It was a delicate dance, one that demanded patience in a realm grown weary of patience. She made her way back into the castle, where a scribe waited to read her a new raven message from White Harbor. The scribe was a soft-spoken man of about 50, with thinning hair and a thoughtful face. He unrolled the parchment and relayed that another Braavosi ship had been sighted far out at sea, too distant to identify in detail, but likely carrying further supplies. The Manderleys had prepared the docks for unloading, and they expected the ship might arrive within a few days, weather permitting. The letter also mentioned that a small caravan from the Vale had made a cautious approach to White Harbor, but upon seeing the heavy guard and Braavosi presence, they turned back, leaving behind only a cursory greeting. Sansa frowned at that. The Vale might have been an ally once, under her cousin Robin Arryn's rule, but too many uncertainties had frayed old ties. She suspected the Vale lords distrusted the conflict brewing between the Crown and the North. They would not side openly with Sansa, not unless they saw a clear advantage. She thanked the scribe and dismissed him, pondering the fragile web that stretched across Westeros. So many threads could fray with a single tug. That evening, as the sun dipped behind Winterfell's walls, casting long blue shadows across the courtyard, the castle made ready for the night. The guards changed shifts, some climbing to the ramparts to keep watch, others descending to the warmth of the great hall to eat and rest. Sansa joined Davos and Brienne for supper at the high table. A hush settled among the lesser lords and visiting dignitaries as she entered, though conversation resumed once she took her seat. She noticed Jaren and her uncles among the crowd, quietly sharing a stew with a few stable hands. The travelers looked grateful for the warmth of the fires. Sansa was glad they had found respite here. It was a small mercy in a landscape so fraught with suspicion. Over bowls of venison soup and dark bread, Sansa conferred in low tones with Davos and Brienne about the ongoing training, the shipments from Braavos, the threat of a Lannister push. She inquired whether any fresh letters had come from the Iron Bank, but Brienne shook her head. None had arrived since the missive warning of Cersei's potential seizure of Braavosi assets. The knight added that she doubted the Crown would attempt such a seizure in the midst of winter. Even if they found Braavosi interests in King's Landing, forcibly holding them might provoke the Free City more directly, and Cersei, for all her boldness, might hesitate to risk a confrontation with Braavos' formidable fleet. Sansa gave a small hum of agreement, but she knew that desperation drove rulers to rash actions. The Queen might weigh the risk of angering Braavos against the risk of letting Sansa grow stronger, and decide there was no choice but to gamble. After supper, Sansa rose and excused herself. She felt the weight of the day pressing behind her eyes. The flicker of torches cast dancing shadows against the stone walls as she climbed the staircases. When at last she reached her chambers, she found her bed turned down and the fire stoked, its glow illuminating the carved rafters overhead. Weariness tugged at her, but she resisted the urge to collapse. Instead, she changed into a thick nightrobe and sat by the fire, a knitted blanket draped over her lap. She stared into the flames, letting their flickering patterns mesmerize her. She remembered the girl she had been, enamored of songs and courtly tales. That girl had believed so firmly in heroes. Now, she believed in action and strategy, in alliances secured by quills and swords. The songs had faded, replaced by a far colder music, yet a kernel of warmth still glowed within her. She felt it whenever she witnessed the resilience of her people, or the loyalty of Brienne, or the unwavering calm of Davos. She felt it in the hush of the Godswood, in the old Ned Stark sense of duty that guided her steps. Perhaps that small flame of hope was enough to guide her through the storm. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply. Outside, the winter wind rattled the shutters, a lonely howl echoing through the night. Tomorrow would bring more decisions, more messages, more rumors. She would face them all with as much strength as she could muster. But for now, in the sanctuary of her chambers, she allowed her guard to lower for a moment, trusting that the men and women of Winterfell would keep watch in the night. And so the hours passed in a quiet vigil, the castle enveloped by swirling snow and flickering torchlight, the hush of a season that cared nothing for crowns or coins. Sansa listened to the wind and thought of the roads locked under ice, the brave Ossi ships forging their way across dark waters, and the men in the Neck, huddled by campfires as they conspired to tighten their grip. The board was set, the pieces shifting. But the wolves of Winterfell had endured many storms before. And now, with the hint of Braavosi gold glinting on the horizon, they might endure this one as well. She whispered a silent oath to the memory of her father and mother, to her siblings scattered by fate, and to the North itself. Then, she sank into a light, uneasy sleep, while the shadows of the night lengthened and the faint echo of howling wolves drifted across the snow.